The air in the Bavarian Alps was thin and sharp the morning the divers surfaced. In their hands, a fragment of steel, stamped with the faded insignia of the Third Reich. It had been buried for more than 70 years beneath the cold green water of Königssee. What lay below was not a myth nor a relic. It was a vault, sealed at the end of the war, hidden from the world, built to outlast defeat. As the mud cleared and the light reached its walls, history began to breathe again. And the truth, long submerged, began to rise. Chapter 1. The Ghost Vault Beneath Königssee. In the closing months of World War II, Germany was collapsing under its own weight. Cities burned under Allied bombers. The Eastern Front bled day and night. Yet in the south, beneath the snow-laced peaks of Bavaria, another war was quietly being waged, one of secrecy, science, and desperation. Königssee, a glacial lake tucked near the Austrian border, was a place untouched by the front lines. Tourists once came here to see the emerald waters, the echoing cliffs, the chapel at St. Bartholomew. But by 1944, the lake's calm had become a camouflage. Beneath its surface, under layers of ice and mountain stone, engineers of the Reich were working against time. The order came directly from the Reich Main Security Office. Officially, it was catalogued as Versuchsreihe K-12, the Königssee experiments. In practice, it was something else entirely. The aim was to design a fully sealed underwater habitat, a chamber that could sustain life for weeks, even months, at depth. If successful, it would allow U-boats to hide indefinitely, invisible to Allied sonar. But the blueprints told only half the story. Above ground, the people of nearby Berchtesgaden noticed changes. Military trucks rolled through narrow roads at night, their headlights blacked out. Local carpenters were conscripted without explanation. Entire areas of the lake were fenced off by SS guards. Fishermen were warned, in quiet threats, never to cast their nets near the southern shallows again. Some obeyed. Others disappeared. The war had already swallowed millions, but the south was different. Here, in the shadow of the Obersalzberg, Hitler's mountain retreat, every project carried the weight of final hope. Propaganda called it the Alpine Fortress. To the engineers, it was simply the end game. And so they built, day and night, in caverns dug beneath the waterline, sealing steel into rock as bombs thundered hundreds of kilometers away. Life above continued in muted fear. Families rationed potatoes and coal. Air raid sirens echoed across the valleys, though no planes ever came this far. Children were told the lake was cursed, that strange lights glowed beneath it after dark. Some nights, soldiers could be seen rowing across the still surface, lowering crates into the depths, their breath forming clouds in the frozen air. The war's propaganda machine painted visions of miraculous technology, wonder weapons that would turn the tide. The Wunderwaffe, they called it. But beneath Königssee, the truth was less glorious. It was cold metal, human endurance, and a quiet cruelty masked as research. Dozens of prisoners from nearby Dachau were transported south under SS escort. None were recorded as returning. Their names, erased from official lists, would not reappear until decades later. By early 1945, the project was nearly complete. The chamber, 20 meters long, cylindrical, pressurized, was locked into a submerged tunnel beneath the lakebed. Supplies were moved in, instruments calibrated. The lead scientist, Dr. Wilhelm Brandt, described it in his final report as a sanctuary for the continuation of German science, should the fatherland fall. Weeks later, the fatherland did. When Allied forces advanced toward Bavaria, orders came to destroy anything that could not be evacuated. But Brandt had other instructions, handwritten, red-stamped, and signed by the SS Technical Division. Do not destroy, seal, preserve for retrieval. On a cold night in late April, explosive charges collapsed the entrance tunnel. Water poured in. Within hours, the entire site vanished beneath the lake, sealed beneath 60 meters of glacial silence. And then, the war ended. Germany surrendered. The documents were scattered, classified, forgotten. The lake returned to its stillness, reflecting only mountains and sky. For the people who lived there, the past sank deeper with each passing year. For nearly 8 decades, Königssee remained a postcard of peace, its depths unexplored, its history sanitized. But in 2019, a group of divers surveying for wartime debris found something impossible. A reinforced hatch, perfectly preserved beneath the sediment. Its hinges fused shut, its markings unmistakably German military issue. When they surfaced, they brought with them the first trace of a story that had waited 75 years to be heard. It began, as most buried histories do, with a question no one wanted to ask. What had really been hidden beneath that tranquil water? And why? Chapter 2. Operation. Northlight, the forgotten radar line. After the guns of World War II fell silent, the world did not find peace. It found a new kind of fear. The ruins of Europe were still smoking when a different front began to form, one without battlefields or declarations. It was a war of silence, of secrets, of invisible signals in the sky. By the early 1950s, the Cold War had divided the world like a fault line. Washington and Moscow stood on opposite sides, both certain that the other was preparing for annihilation. Satellites did not yet exist, and the polar regions, vast, frozen, and uninhabited, became the perfect place to hide or to spy. Both superpowers raced to establish early warning systems across the Arctic. Radar towers, listening posts, and secret bunkers were built faster than they could be mapped. Among them was one that would disappear from every known record: Operation Northlight. Northlight began, officially, as a weather research project. Its funding passed through the US Air Force's Arctic Monitoring Division, a name as cold and unremarkable as the landscape itself. In reality, it was an experimental radar network designed to detect high-altitude objects crossing the polar cap. Soviet bombers, perhaps, or something else entirely. The first installations were built in Greenland, hidden beneath layers of ice, camouflaged as civilian research outposts. But there was more to the story. Declassified memos later revealed that Northlight was not purely American. In 1958, at the height of nuclear paranoia, a covert agreement was struck between select elements of the CIA and a faction within the Soviet KGB. Both sides had detected unexplainable radar echoes over the Arctic Circle, returns that moved against prevailing winds, too slow for meteorites, too high for aircraft. Each side blamed the other. Each side privately was terrified. The compromise was simple: investigate together, deny everything. The agreement was never made public, never recorded in diplomatic channels. The engineers who built the equipment were told only that it was a joint research directive. They worked in silence, shipping crates labeled as telecommunications hardware, unaware that every wire carried the paranoia of two empires. Northlight's main facility, known only by its grid reference, Site 7 Delta, was built into the Greenland permafrost. Inside were rows of vacuum tube consoles, reel-to-reel recorders, and a control room dominated by a single glowing radar screen. Soldiers stationed there described it as timeless. Days and nights blurred into a constant hum of machinery. Outside, the wind howled like distant artillery. Inside, every heartbeat seemed amplified by static. One operator, Sergeant Michael Dorsey, wrote in his diary, "The scope picks up echoes that don't make sense. They move in straight lines, then vanish. Command says it's just reflections. But reflections don't change course." His entries stopped abruptly in February 1961. 2 weeks later, his name appeared on a casualty list: training accident. His family received no body, only a sealed letter of condolence. By the early 1960s, something changed in the Arctic sky. Both American and Soviet technicians began reporting equipment failures whenever Northlight transmitted. Entire radar grids flickered and died. Soviet reports called it electronic interference of unknown origin. The CIA called it anomalous disruption. Engineers called it something simpler: fear. When the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted in 1962, Northlight went dark. Officially, the site was decommissioned. In truth, power continued to flow for another 20 years. Supply flights arrived monthly, manned by contractors who were told never to speak of their work. In exchange, they were paid in cash and silence. The last known transmission from Site 7 Delta was logged in 1984, a single line of Morse code, partially garbled. Contact. Maintain Northlight protocol. Then, nothing. The site vanished from maps. The equipment was sealed under snow and time. The Cold War ended, walls fell, and Northlight became another ghost in the archives, until the thaw came. In 2022, satellite surveys scanning Greenland's receding ice revealed something geometric buried below. a hexagonal grid of metal structures, perfectly preserved. Excavation teams expected Cold War junk. What they found was the bunker, frozen in time, with consoles still intact, tubes still wired, and reels of magnetic tape labeled only K-Target. Forensic teams listened to the recordings. At first just static, then faint tones, rhythmic, mechanical, almost human. Across hundreds of tapes, the same sequence repeated, each stamped with dates spanning from 1958 to 1984. Experts confirmed the pattern wasn't natural atmospheric noise. It was deliberate, encoded. When confronted, both the US and Russian governments denied involvement. Northlight, they said, was never an active operation. Yet internal memoranda, released accidentally through a Freedom of Information request, told another story. Project Northlight, joint classification, eyes only, director level. The document was heavily redacted, but one phrase remained clear: to prevent public release under any circumstance. Even now, the tapes are stored under lock at a NATO facility in Brussels. What they contain, who recorded them, and what they were trying to track remains unsolved. But what's certain is this: for decades, both sides of the Iron Curtain shared a secret that neither wanted remembered, and beneath the ice of Greenland, the hum of their machines still echoes in the frozen dark. Chapter 3: The Black Index of Smolensk, Russia, a city rebuilt from ashes. Its streets whisper stories of invasions, occupations, and quiet defiance. In 2021, within the grey walls of a Soviet-era archive, a historian named Irina Volkov discovered a single, mislabeled reel of microfilm, an administrative accident that would reopen one of the darkest chapters of the Cold War. The film was unremarkable at first glance, dust-covered, sealed in wax, stamped with the words Ministry of Health, 1947. But when Volkov fed it into the scanner, the screen filled with thousands of names. Names without birthplaces, files without diagnoses, men and women labeled only by codes. She thought she'd uncovered a misplaced census. Within an hour, she realized she was holding something far more sinister: the remnants of a vanished program known as Laboratory 12. To understand what she found, we must step back to 1945, the year after Berlin fell. The Soviet Union stood victorious but wounded. 27 million dead, entire cities erased. Stalin's government faced a paradox: immense power, but immense fear. The new enemy was no longer fascism. It was ideology, Western thought, dissent, and the fragile human mind itself. Laboratory 12 was born in the shadows of that paranoia. Its purpose, according to one classified memorandum, was to explore the biochemical pathways of obedience. In practice, it was a state-sponsored experiment in psychological control. The project operated under the NKVD, the forerunner of the KGB, and its personnel included several German scientists captured at Peenemünde, men who once designed nerve agents and experimental drugs for the Third Reich. Now, they worked for Moscow, their expertise repurposed in the name of ideological security. The facility itself was rumored to sit beneath an abandoned hospital outside Smolensk. Locals called it the Black Ward. At night, they said, trucks arrived carrying crates marked with red stars. The drivers never spoke. Guards patrolled in silence. People in nearby villages whispered that the air carried a strange chemical smell, sharp and metallic. From the microfilm, we know this much. Between 1946 and 1953, over 3,000 subjects passed through the Black Ward. Prisoners, political dissidents, even soldiers accused of counter-revolutionary thought. They were not executed. They were studied. The records describe conditioning trials, sessions involving light deprivation, injected compounds, and prolonged exposure to hypnotic suggestion. The language was cold, clinical. Subject exhibits complete compliance, one report reads. Recommend continued administration of compound V7 for long-term observation. Among the documents were signatures, not printed but handwritten, pressed into yellowed pages. Irina cross-referenced them against public records. Many matched mid-level party officials, but one stood out. A. Beria, the son of Lavrenti Beria, Stalin's infamous secret police chief. If authentic, it proved the program's direct connection to the upper hierarchy of Soviet power. What disturbed Irina most, though, were the train manifests. Hundreds of entries marked volunteers, not for return. Their destinations listed as internal transfers, all ending with the same note. Final phase. Authorization by Central Directorate. None of these individuals reappeared in any death registry. It was as if they had been erased from existence. By the early 1950s, the world outside had shifted. The Korean War raged. Nuclear tests lit up desert skies. Stalin was dying. When he finally did, in March 1953, the political machine that sustained Laboratory 12 began to fracture. Orders were given to destroy sensitive materials. Barrels of chemicals were buried. Files burned. But someone, perhaps a bureaucrat with a conscience, perhaps a clerk afraid to disobey, copied portions of the archive onto microfilm and sealed it away under a false label. Ministry of Health. Nothing more. For nearly 70 years, the Black Index remained hidden. When Irina's discovery went public, it sent ripples through the academic and intelligence communities. Moscow denied the archive's authenticity. Fabrications of Western propaganda, the Foreign Ministry said. But handwriting experts confirmed the signatures, and forensic chemists who examined residue samples from recovered vials matched them to early precursors of known psychotropic agents, compounds later found in MKUltra documentation from the United States. The implication was staggering. Both sides of the Cold War, sworn enemies, had mirrored each other's darkest experiments. As the investigation deepened, Irina received anonymous calls. One message, left on her office phone, was brief. A man's voice, older, strained. "You are looking where no one should. Leave it buried." She didn't. Weeks later, her apartment was broken into. Papers scattered, hard drives missing. The police found no fingerprints, no forced entry. She continued her work regardless, piecing together the human stories behind the numbers. Letters written by nurses begging for transfers. A smuggled note from a prisoner. "They say it's medicine. It feels like forgetting who I am." Those words became the title of her paper. Forgetting Who I Am. The Human Cost of Laboratory 12. In the months that followed, governments issued quiet statements, promising transparency. None came. Yet through interviews, cross-references, and declassified fragments, the contours of the truth emerged. Laboratory 12 was not an anomaly. It was a prototype. Its findings formed the basis of later Soviet psychological warfare programs, some still classified today. For the families of those who vanished, the discovery offered no closure, only questions. How far had their country gone in pursuit of control? How many names were never recorded? How many truths still sleep beneath layers of state secrecy? In the dim light of the archive where it all began, Irina Volkov often returned to one specific microfilm frame. It showed a signature, elegant and deliberate, beside a final line of typed text. "Success in silence ensures stability of the state." The film crackled softly as it turned, each rotation a whisper of the past refusing to disappear. The Black Index remains sealed in a government vault. Officially it does not exist, but for those who have seen its pages, its ghosts remain, a reminder that even in peace, the machinery of control never truly stopped. It simply changed its name. Chapter 4. Echoes from the Tyrol Complex. The Austrian Alps have always carried an uneasy beauty, white peaks, quiet valleys, and a stillness that can hide anything. For decades after the war, hikers and locals spoke of sealed tunnels high in the Tyrolean mountains, rusted doors embedded in the rock, humming faintly in the cold. Most assumed it was folklore. Then, in 2018, 3 urban explorers found the entrance. It was a rusted steel hatch hidden beneath a landslide near Imesti. The markings were faint, but visible. A black eagle, the letters RLM, Reichsluftfahrtministerium, the German Air Ministry. Behind it, a tunnel stretched into darkness. What they found inside would unravel one of the last unspoken chapters of the Third Reich's collapse. The walls were reinforced concrete, lined with decaying cables. Radiation meters began to tick softly as they moved deeper. After 40 meters, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber, a command center, perfectly preserved, as if the men inside had just walked out. Maps of Europe lay pinned to the walls. Gauges and valves, still labeled in German, formed the control console of something far more advanced than 1945 technology should have allowed. Stamped on nearly every component was the same phrase: Project Eisenherz, Iron Heart. The explorers filmed everything, posting fragments online before authorities intervened. Within days, Austrian military police cordoned off the site, and international experts arrived under the banner of a radiological containment study. But insiders confirmed what the government refused to. Eisenherz was real, and it wasn't just a myth about an Alpine fortress. It was an experimental reactor. The project began late in 1944. As Allied forces closed in from both fronts, Nazi engineers and physicists were ordered to develop a self-sustaining power source, something compact enough to fit within a train car or submarine, capable of running indefinitely without refueling. It was, in essence, a portable nuclear reactor, decades ahead of its time. Officially, Germany lacked the materials and expertise for such a device. But Eisenherz was not under the official chain of command. It was supervised by the SS Technical Division, men who operated outside scientific ethics, bound only by loyalty and secrecy. The Tyrol site was chosen for its isolation. A rail line tunneled directly into the mountains, leading to a cavern carved by forced labor from occupied Poland. Survivors of the nearby labor camp later testified to seeing glowing crates unloaded at night, guarded by soldiers in unmarked uniforms. They called it the light that hurt to look at. Documents recovered from the site describe a test conducted on February 18, 1945. The goal to achieve self-sustaining. Reaction for 90 seconds. Witness accounts, preserved in OSS interrogation reports, tell of a blinding flash seen miles away. Instruments failed. Men collapsed without visible wounds. The test, though short, appeared to succeed. Within hours, the SS sealed the chamber and evacuated key personnel. Among them was physicist Dr. Klaus Heinemann, a name later appearing in US occupation records, quietly relocated to New Mexico under Operation Paperclip. When Allied forces reached Tyrol 2 months later, they found only rubble. American engineers from the 1269th Engineer Battalion surveyed the ruins, declaring the site neutralized. The surviving documentation was sent to Washington under restricted classification. Yet recently declassified OSS memos reveal that the complex was visited again, months after its supposed demolition, this time by American and British nuclear specialists. The last memo in the file reads, "Reactor core removed. Containment incomplete. Recommend site sealed. For 70 years, no one returned. The entrance was buried. The mountains reclaimed their silence." Until that day in 2018, when the explorers cracked it open and history breathed radioactive dust into the air. The official investigation remains sealed, but leaked reports suggest the presence of isotopes consistent with early uranium enrichment, the same signature later found in experimental American reactors built in 1951. Whether Eisenherz directly influenced Allied research is still debated, but the timeline is telling. Less than 6 years after Germany's surrender, the US Navy began testing compact nuclear propulsion for submarines, technology far beyond what open science could explain at the time. For the people of Tyrol, the revelation was more personal. Some remembered fathers who never returned from the tunnels. Others recalled the quiet nights when soldiers came to their doors, offering food in exchange for silence. They said they were building a radio station, one elderly villager recalled. But the earth would shake sometimes, and the sky would glow. Today, the complex remains sealed behind concrete barriers. Radiation levels still spike near the entrance, and armed patrols guard the perimeter. Officially, it's a safety precaution. Unofficially, it's a wall between the present and a truth too dangerous to acknowledge. Inside those dark chambers, paper crumbles and machines rust. But the symbols remain: the eagle, the serial numbers, the signature of a man who vanished in 1945, his name reappearing in American patent filings 5 years later. Eisenherz was not just an experiment in power, it was a glimpse into what desperation can create when defeat becomes unthinkable. And as the wind moves through the valleys of Tyrol, it carries the faint metallic hum of those forgotten machines, an echo of a war that refused to end quietly. Chapter 5: The Manila Cipher Tapes. In the humid quiet of a Manila warehouse, history returned through static. It was 2023, and renovation crews at a decommissioned US communications center were tearing down a concrete wall when one of them struck metal, a sealed compartment no one knew existed. Inside were dozens of magnetic tapes, each labeled only with the letters E12. What followed was a revelation that would bridge 2 wars, 2 continents, and 1 continuous chain of secrecy. The tapes were traced to station Echo 12, a US signal interception outpost active from the late 1940s through the Vietnam War. It had been part of the Far East, Communications Intelligence Network, monitoring radio traffic across the Pacific. But these recordings were older than any in the facility's archives. The first tape bore a date, August 14th, 1945, the day before Japan's official surrender. The voices were faint beneath the hiss of old tape. Japanese naval operators speaking in clipped, coded phrases, coordinates, transfer instructions. One word repeated over and over, Seraphim, cross-referenced with declassified US intelligence reports. Operation Seraphim appeared nowhere. Not in naval logs, not in diplomatic cables, not in any post-war tribunal documents. Yet the recordings were unmistakably authentic. Analysts working with the Defense Intelligence Agency began decoding the transmissions. What they uncovered suggested that in the final hours before Japan's surrender, elements within the Imperial Navy initiated a desperate evacuation, not of soldiers, but of technology, experimental weapon schematics, scientific archives, and crates labeled Jinrai, Divine Thunder. According to the intercepts, the cargo was bound for southern archipelagos, escorted by submarine convoys under direct orders from an unknown high command. At first, officials assumed the transmissions stopped after the surrender, but the tapes continued. Dates on later reels stretched into the 1950s, the 1960s, even 1973. The voices changed, the language shifted, but the call signs remained the same. Someone, or something, had kept using those frequencies long after Imperial Japan ceased to exist. A former CIA cryptographer described it best. It was as if the war had never really ended, just gone quiet. When the discovery leaked to the press, historians scrambled to make sense of it. The Pacific had been littered with abandoned outposts and wartime caches, but ongoing coded traffic decades later defied explanation. Some speculated it was a rogue intelligence network. Others believed it was a post-war smuggling route protected by ex-military loyalists. A few whispered of an informal alliance between former Axis scientists and Cold War agencies. A global exchange of knowledge too valuable and too dangerous to expose. The more the tapes were analyzed, the darker the implications became. Several transmissions referenced Package 9, a container described as inert yet potent. The phrase matched descriptions of Japanese bioweapon prototypes developed under Unit 731, the infamous wartime research division. But the coordinates on the tapes placed the cargo far from Manchuria, somewhere in the Philippine archipelago, deep within territory later used by US forces during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. That overlap was no coincidence. Declassified documents from 1952 revealed that American intelligence quietly absorbed numerous Japanese scientists after the war in exchange for their research data. The files were sanitized, identities changed. Echo 12 may have been part of the infrastructure built to manage, or conceal, that data stream. Inside one of the Manila tapes, technicians identified a secondary recording track, a feature not common in 1940s magnetic media. The second channel contained a faint American voice. Signal received. Hold relay. Await further instruction. The voice was traced to a known operator at Clark Air Base, circa 1956. It confirmed the unthinkable, that US intelligence had not only been listening, but actively responding. For those who worked the decoding project, the emotional weight was immense. You could hear time in those tapes, one analyst said. You could hear people who thought no one was listening, and then realize someone always was. The discovery reignited debates over Cold War ethics, the blurred line between security and secrecy. Why were these tapes hidden? Why behind a wall, not archived? Some suggest they were buried after the US withdrew from the Philippines in the early 1990s, when the last of its bases were decommissioned. Others believe they were hidden deliberately. Evidence of an agreement no government wanted remembered. Among the final tapes was one marked simply End Sequence. It contained a single Japanese transmission. The sea remembers, we do not. Then silence. Historians now treat the Manila Cipher tapes as a case study in historical continuity, how one conflict's secrets became another's foundation. The Cold War did not erase the shadows of World War II. It inherited them, built upon them, and kept them classified. Today, the tapes rest in a climate-controlled vault in Virginia. Access is restricted. The Pentagon calls them of historical interest. But in the Philippines, divers still search the waters of the Sulu Sea, looking for wreckage that matches the coordinates whispered across decades of encrypted sound. When you listen to the surviving recordings, the hiss, the fading tones, the echoes of men transmitting into the dark, you understand something profound. History is not a sequence of wars and treaties. It's an unbroken signal. Sometimes it fades, sometimes it goes silent, but it never really stops. And somewhere out there, beyond the static, the sea still remembers.